So can I welcome you all to tonight's event, A View from the Top, part of our post-experience networking events here at Macquarie Business School. Can I start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. So welcome to Macquarie Business School. As you know, our philosophy at the school is to turn theory into practice, and part of that are hosting events like tonight, where we're able to sort of talk about very important issues facing the business community, and on this occasion draw on fabulous alum from the school on their experiences and how we can best think about the challenges that lie ahead. A couple of call-outs before I introduce the event proper. Firstly, a call-out to MBA students who we've got in the room today. Today is the first day of the Leadership Theory and Practice unit that Tess Howes is leading, part of a residential unit as part of our revamped MBA. I know they started very early this morning because when I was on main campus at 9 a.m, everyone was in full flight. So, and they've got 4 more days in front of them, but this is an important part of that. So welcome all, and please ask questions as we get underway. If you do have questions, there is a Mentimeter. Once we get underway, you'll be able to see the code for that up on the screen. Please use your phones to input questions, vote for things, and that will form the second part of the discussion. The other call out is we at the business school have been working with employers over the last 6 to 12 months to get opportunities for our students, paid cadetships, paid internships as part of our revamped curricula. And we're organising a conference for employers who've committed. So over the last 6 months, we've had 29 companies commit better part of 60 cadetships for students, Macquarie Bank, Quantium, Deloitte, EY, the Sydney Opera House. If that could be your company, please come up, find one of us in the future. All we are looking for are opportunities for our students and paid opportunities. So in recognition of the work that they do. So if you are interested in that, reach out, and I'm delighted to invite you along to that event. So we're in a treat. We've got a treat in front of us tonight, focused on the challenges of board governance and the diversity that allow that board governance to thrive. I know it's often thought that leadership is a lonely place, and I think there are probably no lonelier places than on the boards and chairs of boards like the distinguished panel that know about these challenges that we have tonight. But these roles are not simply process roles. These are roles that shape direction. They think about the capabilities of an organisation. They're highly strategic roles. And so tonight we're going to think about how do boards organise themselves, work with community expectations, confront the challenges that are all around business, and direct that into the management of an organisation and the leadership of that, and guide things onto a good path. So tonight, to my left, we have Catherine Livingstone, who has a wide variety of roles I can't fully encompass, but executive career, including as the CEO of Cochlear, President of the Business Council Australia, Chief Executive Women, Chair roles in Telstra, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, CSIRO, and a Companion of the Order of Australia. So congratulations, Catherine, this year for that acknowledgement. Lynn Cobley, a seasoned banker across many different institutions, CEO of Westpac Institutional Bank, the chair of Westpac Asia Advisory Board, Group Treasurer of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and senior roles in Barclays Bank, Citigroup, and on the board of Macquarie University. And I should mention both Catherine and Lynn are alums of the school with bachelor degrees, and also Jason Johnson, Bachelor of Economics from Macquarie University, and an entrepreneur who, after a legal career at Allens, has gone on to found Johnson Partners, one of the leading board advisory and executive search firms in the country, and also presence in New Zealand, and a great sponsor, amongst other things, of the Asian Australian Leadership Awards, focused on diversity in boards from that vantage point. So, with that in mind, and with the Mentimeter now set up, I'm going to maybe invite Catherine to open the discussion today. And maybe, Catherine, to cast you back to your experience whilst you were the chair of the CBA. I mean, it's still within live and living memory, the role that you served there for the bank, but during a time of the Banking Royal Commission. And I just wondered if you could help share with us tonight the challenges that you found in that role as the Royal Commission came on, and how you thought about leading the board through some of those challenges.
Thanks. That doesn't sound on, does it? Is it on? Okay, good. So for CommBank, it was less about the Banking Royal Commission, actually, and going back probably a year before just over a year before the Royal Commission started, the anti-money laundering regulator had served proceedings on the bank for non-compliance with anti-money laundering regulations. That's a long story in its own right, but on top of various issues over the prior years, the banking regulator to the bank to find out why all of these things were going wrong. So it wasn't just one, it was multiple non-compliance with regulation across different sectors of the bank. It was a very intense 6 months. They surveyed 10,000 employees. They interviewed directly many thousands, so on. So they produced that report in April, May 2018 with 35 recommendations, and it was a pretty savage read. And I think when everyone across the bank read it, there was no way that it could be denied because it was an independent review and it had been a very intense review. So everything was criticised from the board through management across all the sections of the bank for poor, what they call culture, poor accountability and poor governance. Well, you can fit everything under that umbrella. So the 35 recommendations, and the bank, as soon as the report landed, the bank started scurrying around, picking up this recommendation, we're going to fix this, and various groups were just deciding which recommendations they would immediately work on and fix. And the board stopped that and said, this is a fundamental review. Responses to 35 recommendations is not going to solve the root cause. And so the board and management team worked together to determine what were the thematic issues going through these recommendations, came up with 9 thematic considerations, developed milestones to address and fix the issues in those thematic areas. And the milestones were divided into design, implement, embed. So before anything was done, it had to follow a design rule framework to make sure that the contention between all the different milestones was addressed, because you could see resource and objective contention was going to happen. Once all the design criteria were established, then there was the implement phase, and then there was the embed phase. It took 3 years plus a year of embedding, so that's 4 years. It was thousands of people in the bank. It was documented to within an inch of its life. It was supervised by an independent body, Promontory. Every quarter, Promontory wrote a report. The bank made that available publicly on the website, so there was full transparency, obviously working with the regulator. Basically, it was rewiring the engine room, which was an extraordinary undertaking, and the teamwork involved, were working to deadlines. The plan that was devised in the 6 weeks after the report came down from APRA was pretty well exactly the plan that was delivered on time 3 years later, notwithstanding COVID. So it was an example of the board and management team working together, engaging whole company, because it really was, it was, I just can't describe how appalling everyone felt when that report came down from APRA. So when I say it was less about the Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission was, another issue, and that was fairly traumatic for everyone, but nothing in comparison to this APRA report. So the response would not have been successful if everyone hadn't worked together, and the board and the management team working as a meta teams, and as I said, thousands of people across the bank accountable for delivering that plan. So, and that's really what underpinned the ability of the bank to recover its reputation, recover its place in the sector, and also, it's a whole separate conversation, but to continue to work on its strategy throughout that whole time. I think that's probably enough.
Catherine, maybe just one follow-up to that before then moving to the other question. I mean, in that instance, you had an external props that allowed for that sort of review. In the other boards that you've had, have there been instances where that has been self-initiated, that kind of prompt, or has it often been something external that's allowed or created the context in which that kind of reset has been possible?
Well, it just might be my bad luck, but if I go to CSIRO, when I started on that board, there was a crisis because the government had not provided any funding in a major funding envelope for CSIRO. The Telstra, there was the NBN, and so yes,
William, can I maybe turn to you next and think about how do we respond to setting up? Yep. I think the microphone's fine. Why don't we keep it as it is? Lynn, maybe you can just speak a little bit to how do we create governance that's fit for purpose? I know there've been a number of people with experience on boards who've provided commentary about Australia having a particular one-size-fits-all. You know, we train through the FAICD and how we approach aspects of governance. Can you maybe speak a little to how we navigate that in the context of crises that we can't always predict, or, you know, changes that are playing in the macro environment?
Thank you. And look, before I go on to that, I'll make another comment about CBA, because I actually am on the board of CBA now, been there for about 18 months. So I followed as Catherine was coming off. I've now joined the board. And one comment I've got to make, and I did tell Catherine this, that when I went through my week-long induction of being a board member, every single meeting I had with management, from senior management all the way down, there would be some mention in that meeting of Catherine asked us to do. And Catherine required this report. Dun, 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 dun. And Catherine, I can honestly say in the 18 months I've sat on that board, there has not been a single meeting where there hasn't been mentioned. Now, what Catherine think about this? So we should not underestimate the impact of this wonderful woman and the work she did as chair. So when it comes to your question around one size fits all, and I think you're talking about the regulatory and the learning environment, I mean, it's actually quite challenging being a director these days. If you take a look at the last 20 years, as events have come up and as new rules come about, all these rules tend to get layered onto another set of rules or to another set of rules. And we end up with this very, very complex environment. And I find it very interesting that in January, the Australian Law Reform Commission did a 3-year review of financial services rules and corporations law post the Royal Commission to see what recommendations they could make. And aside from, say, coming up with a 362-page report and then saying there's 58 recommendations, they called it a maze of a porridge, the set of rules. So it needs to be an entire, overhaul, because it really is not fit for purpose. And that's even before you take up some of the more modern risks, if you like, AI, cybersecurity, scams, climate action, etc. How do you incorporate all of that in there? So we've done a lot of work to do. I think Eric, in particular, some of those comments, and there was a very distinguished chair who made quite a stand around the ASX listing governance rules and around the requirement for committees and subcommittees, etc., and questioned whether they really made sense. I have to say, in the experience I've had, I think committees are actually quite helpful. They allow you to dial up and dial down with really focused attention on issues as they come on board. And, my experience, and it depends on your chair, for those committees that are very pertinent and to go to the heart of the organisation, quite often you see every board member sitting on them anyway. A common one for banks is risk committees. They're a very popular one to go to. In fact, I'd say you'd be mad if you are a board member on a bank not to go to the risk committee. So I think there actually is real value there. What I would say, though, is it still comes down to the quality of the directors. You've got to have good directors who are really curious about the business, want to really dig into it, and are prepared to do a lot of external sort of education and understanding the context of the environment they're in, rather than just turning up and thinking, if I read the papers, that'll be enough, but never is enough. That's my sense on that question.
So maybe building, and I know, Catherine, when you addressed the AICD summit a couple of weeks ago, you made the comment in governance that it's about direction, the controls, but also capability. And so thinking about the capabilities of boards, Jason, I know you are doing this every day. You're in the conversation in your boardrooms around what chairs are looking for, what boards are looking for. Can you say a little bit around how boards are currently thinking about skill mix, capability mix, finding the right kinds of ingredients to that, those fruitful kinds of conversations?
Thank you, Eric. Let me set the scene first. So if we talk about the ASX 300, so the top 300 largest listed companies in this country, there is not a lot of diversity reflected across those boards in many respects. 91% of that population are Anglo-Celtic. And if we look across this room, that certainly doesn't reflect the great diversity that we have in this room or in our country by our customer groups that many of those companies are serving. We now have 36% representation of women across the ASX 300, which is a tremendous step up from 8% in 2008. But still, in my mind, a failing that we don't have greater representation of gender across our leading boards. When we think about First Nations, who represent 3% of our population, we only have 4 First Nations directors across our top 300 companies. They represent 7 seats across those top 300 companies. I think that's appalling and a great failing of governance in this country. And openly gay or LGBTIQ plus people, there are only 4 openly gay directors across our top 300 companies. Again, just doesn't align with our population and very colourful and diverse population groups of customers and stakeholders. So setting that scene, there is some room for optimism. I was involved in a report released a couple of weeks ago called the Green Shoots Report, which Deloitte co-authored with the 30% Plus Club. And a number of the authors there were able to evidence a number of situations, anecdotal at this point rather than systemic, but hoping to point towards a trend towards greater diversity being brought onto boards. And there's so much evidence now about why diversity that delivers better decisions at boards and in management settings as well. I'm sure you've studied that in your various courses along the way. What we've seen as a trend as an executive search firm is a desire by great chairs to bring greater diversity onto those boards. And John Mullen, who followed Catherine into the Telstra chair role, spoke when we released that paper 2 weeks ago. He described 3 buckets of candidates. Domain specialists. If you're running a major telco or a major bank, you need people who understand how to run that bank. That goes without saying. Functional experts. Those are the people that often come from an accounting, finance, legal, or broader governance background, and they find their ways onto the chairs of the audit committee, the risk committee, increasingly HR, people with deep, sophisticated HR expertise onto the HR and RIM committees. So there are some wonderful examples now popping up across our major companies of diversity in a third bucket that John described, where people can be more thoughtful about bringing accentuated strengths. And that's where he makes the case there's a greater opportunity to bring more diversity of thought, experience, cultural diversity And what we're seeing increasingly is a real demand for people with that are digitally fluent, people that can help navigate the AI and broader emerging technology wave that we're all facing. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of that. And so you need boards that can understand that deeply. But equally, we're facing decarbonisation and energy transition. And so we've seen a rapid uptake of capability. Only 10% of directors 10% of boards across that 300 say that they have capability around the board table that really fundamentally understand the decarbonisation need, and in some cases, it's an existential threat for those organisations. So really there is a greater need for greater diversity, and I'm pleased as an optimist to say that we can see some green shoots, but plenty of work to be done.
So if I can just add, Jason, to that, and it is really encouraging to see the greater diversity. But I think we have to be careful that we don't just focus on what looks like diversity, because it's diversity of thinking we actually want, and the ability to ask questions from different angles. So, across those three buckets, we just have to make sure that we're actually getting people who are asking the right questions, not jumping to the conclusion. So it's a tricky balancing act, and it's also people have to get on with each other. No, not to be friends, but to be friendly, shall I say? Because you can have a great person, and if they're a unhelpful style and personality, as you know, they can really cause a board to be dysfunctional. So it's multidimensional, this diversity business. I think very, very, very challenging, and you can never stop as a board working on it. And there's no equilibrium, I think.
So, Catherine, maybe building on that idea and thinking about the role of the chair as building the consensus across the board directors, and in a situation where you have diverse views, different expectations of what an organisation might be doing or what the community expects of that organisation present, how do you begin to form consensus out of that? And Elizabeth Sheedy, who's one of our professors, just in preparation for this, shared her book with me, Risk Governance, Biases, Blind Spots and Bonuses. And I think that the bonuses and the remuneration seem to be a particularly good lightning rod to these kinds of questions. And I know this in terms of the interest in Vice-Chancellor salaries, for example. But broadly, there are going to be all kinds of views around the remuneration of the CEO, the remuneration of the leader. How do you begin to collect those diverse views around the board and begin to find a way forward if there are genuinely diverse views about how you address controversial issues like remuneration?
So remuneration is, it's the one committee you just don't want to be on, because you'll never get it right. If you satisfy the individuals, you're not satisfying the shareholders, and if you satisfy individuals and shareholders, the regulators are not satisfied. So you really have to think, the board has to think for itself, what does it really think the right framework is? And then you have to iterate on that framework. It's a co-design with management, actually, because you can have great remuneration framework, but if it's not an incentive, then you're not going to achieve what you want. So you really have to work hard at it, Eric, and be prepared to let it flex and exercise board discretion where appropriate, and evolve it year after year. As I say, you never get it right.
I'm just conscious we're down to one microphone. Do we have a backup microphone there? Can we let it build on?
Yeah, I just want to build on the question of what Catherine has said. I think it was the late Charlie Munger had that famous quote, show me the incentive scheme and I'll show you what's going to happen with this company. So, there's a lot of cynicism around it. And of course, listed companies in particular had a lot of attention from a lot of activist groups, a lot of proxy firms, And now that you have the one strike vote, I think Centre Group today got a strike, their first strike. I mean, there's a powerful tool out there to try and get change in companies that may not really actually be associated with the REM report. They're unhappy about something else, but that's the only tool they've got to use in AGM. I mean, I'd give another perspective on this. We're seeing a lot of companies leave the ASX listing at the moment and becoming private. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that. There's a lot of cash floating around. There's a lot of private equity firms. But one of the reasons that is often given is that people don't want to have the light shone on remuneration structures and on, having too much compliance and too much, if you like, bureaucracy and red tape. They want to be able to run these companies privately. And I think we can go too far sometimes in our criticism of some of these measures, because we're just going to see less and less light shone on issues that we are criticising a lot, because we are seeing the light shone on it. And so anyway, that's just a view. And it was interesting. I was at lunch today, actually saw lunch with the ACCC Commissioner, and this came up as a topic, and people were saying if they're seeing more of this, and this being one of the key reasons that these companies are changing their funding structure.
Jason, do you want to say anything on this point?
I just comment that the rise of private capital is extraordinary, and we have seen just an absolute explosion in this country and in New Zealand. And I think we're going to see some extraordinary differences. Private capital is nimble. It doesn't have the same scrutiny. To your point, it put in place incredible incentives that could be multiples of what a listed peer might generate in the same situation. So it's certainly a space to watch.
So speaking to that topic of scrutiny and the light shine on things, I mean, it seems that now there's even an increasing scrutiny on the percentage of time that directors are spending on different issues, and some of this is getting reported in the annual reports. I mean, at what point does this go too far? Can you give a little bit of context, Lynn, to how this is coming about, or how it's changed perhaps through your purview? Catherine, Jason, you might want to add to that, but I'm just interested in maybe if you could speak to these kinds of forms of scrutiny that are emerging.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, some of the scrutiny has come around the extra time that we've been spending as boards on things like cybersecurity, on resilience, and on compliance. I'd actually come back at that and say, as we are strategically digitising more of our business and building digital ecosystems, we are creating more risks for our customers and for the group by having a bigger attack surface, basically. And so I can't believe that there'd be a single person who would say, I want a board to spend any less than a fair chunk of time worrying about cybersecurity risks, particularly in the context of two major attacks that you saw happen in 2022 against Medibank and Optus, and the knowledge that we are being attacked all the time, and it's just a question of our perimeter and our security being tight enough to keep those attacks out. So I think there is a lot to be said that we are spending a lot of time on those sort of issues and resilience, but I actually think it's necessary. I mean, my view is, would there be a single person in this room that would think, I'd rather have the CBA board spend a lot more time on strategy and less on cybersecurity if tomorrow we wake up and there's a big cybersecurity issue? So I don't think, I think it depends. It depends on the context, and that was why I mentioned in certain committees you want to dial up and dial down the focus of what they're focusing on, depending on the context of the environment. So, yes, there's a lot of work there. I mean, Catherine, when she was chair of CBA, dealt with a lot of issues that she's outlined, but these are big, complex organisations, and you just have to be able to create the right balance between strategy, and every single meeting there is strategy threaded through it. I can assure you of that. But we have to keep our eye on the operational processes, make sure the frameworks all hang together as well.
Catherine, do you want to comment on that, and both in terms of changes over time, but also perhaps differences by sector? I mean, finance being one, but I mean the university sector, or telcos and others. Your observations?
So I think, Lynn, it comes back to your point on committees, and
the best way a board can work is to leverage its committees to do a lot of the detailed work and making sure that the compliance and the technology and the risk management, etc., are covered, and then bring that to the board, but allow the board time to spend on strategy. So when I do an agenda, it's divided into thirds, and the first third is strategy, and the second third is business performance, and the last third is compliance. Not because compliance is not important, but if you start with compliance, you'd never get to strategy. And the compliance third can then leverage all of the work that's been done across the committee. But you really have to discipline yourself to start with strategy. Otherwise, as I say, you'll never get to it.
So maybe a last question before we go to the floor, and so an invitation again to go to Menti and start putting forward your questions. Jason, you've spoken already about some of the percentages in the ASX 300. There's been talk about gender quotas on boards. You sponsor an important award that's trying to encourage new forms of leadership. What's your view or vision around what the future is going to look like in this country, how we get there, what are the steps that we need to take further beyond what already is in place? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Great, thank you, Eric. And I come at this, as a parent of 4 kids, and I always think about the landscape that I want my kids, 3 girls, 1 boy, twin adopted girls from Taiwan. What's the landscape that I want for them as they grow their careers? And hopefully they don't go into the search game like their dad. But I think about the pathways that, and at the moment we in this country, happily, we haven't gone for quotas. I don't think that's a safe and sensible pathway. But we have used targets in most major organisations with some great success. And I did quote earlier 8% female representation on major listed boards in 2008, 36% today. We've reset from, there's clubs like the 30% Club that was set up back in the in the late 90s actually. And they've reset to 30% plus now as we've gone past 30% representation. And when most of us are looking to 40-40-20, if you've heard of that protocol, 40% men, 40% women, 40%, 20% other, to represent, get proper representation across organisations. And, I think I agree with Catherine that, getting a cohesive board is critical, but I still can't believe that 91% of Anglo-Celtic representation adequately represents, the communities that those companies serve. And I think we need to do more to ensure that we do, ensure high quality diversity of thought, absolutely, Catherine, across all boards, and that stakeholders, customers, investors and others do hold organisations to account, and they do. Some of the largest investors in the world speak, frequently with people like Catherine and Lynn, and make their case for diversity. So, I'm confident that there will be further change, but as I say, I think there's lots to do.
Anything you want to build on that, Catherine or Lynn?
Oh no, I mean, it's funny that you should say that about large investors. I remember being taken aside in a room by the president of BlackRock, one of the biggest investors in the world, and certainly one of the biggest investors in these banks. This was when I was in a group executive role at one of the other majors, and he wanted to know what was the lived experience as a female at the bank that I was working in, because he was tired of just being given all the statistics and all the numbers. He wanted to know, what did I see? What did it feel like? Was I being given as many opportunities as others? Now, I was a group executive at this place, so I was reporting into the CEO, but he just wanted to have a quiet conversation because it was really important to them. And so that will make change, because in the same way that with the climate action piece, investors are really pushing for credentials. You're seeing it happening through the super funds at the moment, and the threat of putting board directors, their own directors, onto boards. That makes people sit up and take notice and take action.
So I might build on that point for being a group executive, that's the key for having a greater representation of women on boards. It's women getting that senior management experience, which means that women have to get that mid-career experience. So the entry-level positions for women, I think, generally well represented. Mid-career is where the challenges are, because with family responsibilities and so on. But unless women have got that mid-career and more senior operating experience, it's actually very dangerous to go on a board for any individual. Because unless you've actually worked inside an organisation and understand how it works, the pitfalls, have P&L responsibility, have to deal with crises and so on, you can't sit on a board and understand what management's going through, and that's really important. So I think the more focus we have on women in senior management roles, the more we'll be able to have increased representation on boards.
Thank you, Catherine. So moving to the questions now, and they're coming in and in interesting ways. I just maybe one back to you, Catherine. And it goes like this. You mentioned at the FAICD conference that asking the question of what's the second best answer is often a good way of designing a solution. Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
Well, I'll tell you who taught me, and that was my honours professor at Macquarie. And we would do case studies. That's good. And we would come in, and there was a small group, half a dozen of us, and we'd all be very proud. We worked on the case study. We had it nailed. And on every occasion, this professor, Carrick Martin, I don't know whether you know Carrick Martin, he just pulled the rug from under us and taught us that you really have to look for that second right answer. Don't jump to the first right answer. You might come back to that first right answer in the end, but you have to credential it by finding a second right answer. So it's the point is, don't jump to conclusions. Don't go for the answer. Just keep asking the questions. So it was a very painful learning experience, but it stayed with me, as you can see, for the rest of my life.
So just so I understand that point, the idea is that there isn't a single right answer, and therefore by understanding the different options, you can make more discerned choices. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. But it's the discipline of just keep asking the questions. And then the answer will emerge.
I like that. It's great.
I'd actually like to build on that, and it comes a little bit down to what I was talking about earlier on, I think with a couple of people here, about root cause analysis. You know, if you find a problem that's coming up, and sometimes it's hard in these big complex organisations. We learnt this searingly through the Royal Commission. Things got lost and buried down in the silos of these big organisations, and people hadn't managed to connect the dots as to there's a systemic problem here, or there's a customer that's been lost in the system, or there's a product here that doesn't work, or we're charging a fee for service, no service. And at being able to peel back the onion, because the first answer will be, well, no, there's not a problem here. We don't have this here. And then it'll be, but wait a minute, if it's a problem in two other organisations and not here, why isn't there something else here? Peel back the onion a bit more. Have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? And so, yes, I think that's the hard thing, isn't it, about asking the right question and more of them to get to the bottom of it. And it's a difficult challenge for the board, I think.
So, Lynn, maybe building on that and going to our top voted question, which is an invitation for others to vote on these questions. There's just been a bit of commentary around the importance of middle management experience, senior management experience. And the question here is, why do large organisations have mega failures in compliance, even though there are galvanising leaders within the organisation?
Well, I think that varies from organisation to organisation. That is definitely not going to be a one-size-fits-all problem. I think for some companies it'll be the lack of the quality of people sitting on the board and in senior executive management. Now, let's face it, the board only comes in once a month for 2 or 3 days, whereas you've got senior executives and CEOs in there that are there the whole time. So hopefully you've got the right people in those roles that are wired the right way. You've got to wonder whether you've got the incentives set up in the right way, whether the frameworks are there that are being being, tight frameworks that are working in place. But I think each one of them will be an idiosyncratic reason as to why that's not the case. But you still need, even if you've got all those frameworks there, and it comes back to almost your earlier question around one size fits all risk management, you've still got to have really good quality people in these roles. And I think in the past we have overlooked, we've just been talking about diversity and we've just been talking about the depth of management experience that you need. I think we've overlooked that in some boards.
And I think over the last decade, we've seen a pivot from can we do it, are we lawfully able to do something, to should we do it, and seeing that embedded within governance in the country at board and leadership teams, I think is driving much better outcomes. And many of the failings of organisations through the banking and aged care and other royal commissions have point to people working, thinking they had the licence, but really not thinking with integrity. So
I think it also comes back to the very basic, do we understand our compliance obligations? And I think that's what CommBank found and others have found. Somehow there was an assumption that everyone would know what they were and what to do. But unless you rigorously analyse from the legislation, from the rules, from the regulatory environment, what your compliance obligations are, and put systems in place and have capable people and have checks that those people and the systems are working, you will have non-compliance. And we've seen that's what happens.
There's a thread of questions here, just building on some of these topics, because we've got a number of MBA students here, a number of international MBA students. We've had a prior topic with Jennifer Westacott and Martin Parkinson on visas and migration. And maybe a way into sort of reframing bits of this is how international and world-class are our board governance arrangements? I mean, is there a sort of a currency of international directors who talk with each other, or are we largely existing within an Australian ecosystem? And likewise, how international is the experience in our mid and senior management inside the banks, or are we largely operating within a national experience? Can you speak a little bit to, the international dimensions of our industry and our employment arrangements?
Very happy to. So we have a number of organisations in this country that truly work and compete on the world stage, and just by definition, they need international talent within those organisations. But that doesn't mean that the domestically focused organisations don't need to ensure that they have world-class DNA within those organisations, and that then has a requirement that they consider where does that world-class talent sit. And if we think about AI and other emerging technologies or climate and decarbonisation, there are other countries around the world that have demonstrated much greater and earlier adoption of some of those technologies. So many of the organisations that we serve will naturally look to those pools of talent in markets where there has just been a greater depth or a governmental support for longer than the Australian market, and then benchmark the local talent against those to ensure at every time, and for the major roles, CEO, C-suite, probably one level down, that you are ensuring that you've got the best talent to support whatever that strategy or organisation is focused on. So I think international focus on executive roles is absolutely critical. On the board side, again, we have seen an increasing appetite for leading organisations, particularly those that play in international markets, to have international representation on their boards, and that's sensible. I mean, you think about the geopolitical risk that's playing out in the world right now. If you've got supply chains into Asia, or worse, into Europe right now, or the Middle East, there could be, you're facing tectonic shifts and serious threats. And to have someone that has genuine experience in those markets of those supply chains would add enormous value in the current climate, for example. So I think, and coming back to Catherine's earlier comment, boards need to function effectively. So if you've got someone in North America or Europe, that can be very awkward to run a 2-day strategy day if they're not going to attend in person. So you then, at a very practical level, have to ensure that anyone that's joining a board can actually make the contribution to the board and make a meaningful in-person contribution when required to the organisation as well.
Maybe another question on the nature of difference. So we've talked a little bit about how some companies are going private. Can you say a little bit around what difference that implies in terms of board behaviours or board governance and management interactions? How does that look different in the listed setting versus in the private company setting in terms of, I don't know, risk appetite, how they structure, the nature of the relationship?
From my experience, I've seen we work with a lot of both global private equity firms and local private equity firms, and I think the governance is actually very similar. The focus on growth and delivery and implementation is so high and so great, and it's not that they can't remediate. In fact, they can remediate faster than public companies because they don't have the scrutiny. So we've seen a number of major organisations exit substantial parts of businesses that were challenging. Wealth was one of those segments in the financial services sector where there is now private equity involvement, and those businesses can be remediated, and then the accelerator can be applied in a much more effective and faster way than probably under public ownership. And that's not just true of the financial services sector, that's true of private capital all around the world, and that's why they can often deliver returns that those same organisations couldn't realise in a public setting.
It's interesting though, and depending on the structure of the individual boards, it's from a governance point of view, the distinction between the responsibilities of a director and the responsibilities of a shareholder. So it sounds simple because the shareholders might be sitting around the table. That's fine, but there'll be multiple shareholders. And so then they have to put their director hat on to do what's in the best interests of the company, not necessarily what's in the best interests of them as shareholders being the leading thought in their mind, which it often is. And so it's a very interesting governance question.
And in fact, to that point, there are some very significant organisations, including in Australia, that are publicly listed but still have very significant, often majority private equity participation, and often multiple private equity players in that. And I did a CEO role last year, very complex because it was listed, so independent directors and 3 major shareholders not necessarily aligned, and so it can be quite challenging from a governance perspective.
Maybe coming at the question of diversity through a slightly different lens, I've got a question here saying, as a well-meaning board member who wants to see change, how do you deal with the inability to frame, or how do you frame incentives to accelerate diversity of thinking within the management team? So in other words, if you're on the board, you can see that there's a gap. How do you begin to support or drive that execution? What are the kind of tools and mechanisms that you've found are most successful there?
Well, I can give one idea. Usually your incentives. You'll have KPIs, key performance indicators. Those key performance indicators, if this is the way you feel that the organisation needs to be driven, will have a diversity element there. And you will then, when it comes to the end of the year, when you're evaluating performance, you will take a look at what hires have been made, what processes have been gone through to try to, as Catherine said, move people through the pipeline. To get there, and it needs to be a very systematic approach, if you like, and it needs to be brought up at the table. If you're sitting there and you're talking to somebody who their entire leadership team looks pretty much the same, you need to be giving some pretty direct feedback about that, and they'll get the point. They'll get the point after a while.
I mean, maybe building on this, and Catherine, a way of sharpening this to you as well. I'll read the question and then I might pitch it a little bit differently. But clearly a board needs to work with a company's management. How do you tread the line between not working closely enough and working too closely? And I think maybe that particularly salient for the chair who has to work with the CEO. How do you get to a situation where the chair and CEO may be drifting apart from where the rest of the board of directors might be, or some such? What's the right balance between being close versus being, having some distance?
So the relationship between the chair and the CEO is absolutely pivotal. And it's back to friendly but not friends. So as a chair, you want to be able to challenge the CEO, but you also want the CEO to challenge you as chair. So fostering that right degree of mutual challenge is crucial. And then the chair is treading that very fine line between representing the board to management and representing management to the board. And you hope you never have to choose. And I think probably twice in my career I've had to choose to support management over the board, which is a very challenging situation. And it's a big judgment call, and if it goes wrong, it'll go very wrong. But you have to make sure that management feels supported and challenged, and you have to make sure that the board understands what management's going through. So the board can pontificate and ask for all this information and tell management what to do. That's not very helpful. So it's how you have an effective discussion around the board table so that there is engagement between board and management. And I use the word discussion very deliberately. It's not a Q&A. It's not presentations. It's actual discussion. And that just keeps board and management together. But it's the chair's role to foster that discussion and make sure it's discussion on the right issues that are going to help management, not on necessarily just what the board thinks. And that's where the relationship with the CEO is so critical, because the CEO will bring through what management would really like to have discussed at the board.
Can I just, in a listed organisation, there's an obligation to do board reviews or board appraisals. Catherine and I were discussing earlier. That provides the opportunity to test some of those cultural things. How cohesive? Is there appropriate constructive challenge within the board? Is there appropriate constructive challenge between board and management? Because you also interview key management personnel in those reviews as well. So you do get some data each year that you can build on, and you can then work towards some cultural change at the board level, or possibly recomposition of the board if you're not getting the right approach or a constructive approach. We often get called in when some of those board appraisals have shown up a less constructive approach by a particular member around the board, and they're just not engaging with their colleagues, and they're often not engaging well with management, and that can be quite destructive. So you get that feedback and then you can remediate.
Going to another question here, because often that conversation is instantiated in board papers. And Lynn, you were saying before this that sometimes in your preparation for bank board meetings, you're working through 1,500 pages. And so the question here is,
good day.
What does the right balance of board reporting look like to you? What is the perfect board pack address, and with what sort of frequency?
There's quite a defined, framework in which the board, the CBA board, at least if we use that as an example, works by, and Catherine will be very familiar with that because I think she set most of that up. But there is a certain amount of meetings that will take place on the subcommittees, a certain amount of topics that will come around to the board meetings. Some are every meeting, so occupational health and safety, other issues around obviously finance performance, the CEO's report, CSIRO's report, various other things, and then others will be spread out. And I think that it really does depend on what is the context, what are the major issues that you're dealing with in the day. Now, when Catherine was going through all the problems that CBA had there, I'm sure that the regulatory action plan and the response to the prudential inquiry would have been way up there. A lot of time spent on that. At the present time, there's a little bit of clear air, so there's a lot of time being spent at the moment on, I talked about cyber and resilience and other matters because we've just got to dial that up because of the environment we're in. But we also have a little more time for strategy and, there's the tech companies coming in, etc. I think it's a constant balancing act. I've got to say, in the time that I've been on the board, there's already been 2 big discussions about whether we've got the right mix now as we get further in terms of getting some of those risk frameworks bedded down that needed to be bedded down. There's a lot more work still going on. And what does that open up time for? So I'd say it's constantly evolving. I don't know that I have an exact answer as to what should be the mix, and it would depend from industry to industry and company to company. But it's in a big complex organisation like a major bank, there's going to be not just because of the rules I talked about earlier on, but just because of the risks that organisation runs. And for us to be able to serve our customers and the communities and our stakeholders, the regulators, the political environment, we need to address those very, very well, and we'll focus on making sure they're addressed well before we look at other matters.
Catherine, maybe I can invite you to close out on this and say a little bit about what you've learned in terms of board packs, board management, how to curate that conversation, both in the meeting but also in the papers.
So a couple of things. It's really helpful to have a forward board planner so that you can see out over 12 months what's going to be turning up on each board meeting in a routine sense, and how you make room, as Lynn said, for the things that are non-routine. But I would say a short board paper is a good board paper. And if you can't get your point across in maximum 5 pages, but ideally less, and certainly not PowerPoint, then you don't understand the point that you're trying to make. And I think the best papers are, they follow the what, so what, then what rubric. And if you have that discipline, it's amazing how efficient you can be in writing the paper, and therefore how efficient the discussion is.
Well, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time today to share the various experiences that you've had. Can I invite the audience just to join me in thanking Lynn, Jason and Catherine for their time today?